So, a couple of clarifications. Since much of this presentation is complaining about ARM, it's worth emphasizing the fact that they pay my monthly salary. I'm employed by ARM, assigned to Linaro full-time, so I probably get away with it. I initially got asked if I could do some kind of session for Connect, and I said, is it okay if I just do a rant? And they said, yeah, sure. So basically that's what I'm doing. There have been some mistakes made with regards to actually the way UEFI was brought onto the ARM architecture. I'm going to try to list them. I'm going to try to make sure once and for all that people understand which bits were really bad and you shouldn't look at for examples for how to do things. So we see less of that in the future. And then maybe I'm going to try to be a bit more positive towards the end. We'll see. So, said mainly about complaining. First part is complaining about ARM. Second part is complaining a bit about UEFI, mainly EDK2 though. And the third part, yeah. Because in general I find most people aren't that deeply familiar with UEFI, I'll go through a quick little glossary here. UEFI, when I say UEFI, and I don't actually get it wrong myself, I'm referring to the specification that is maintained by the UEFI forum. EDK2 is the actual code base, right? That is the source code you use to build your firmware. Linaro EDK2 is a Git tree which we use for making basically monthly releases, which add some platform support and things on to EDK2, which doesn't exist upstream. It really isn't a starting point that someone else should be cloning to start doing a platform port themselves. And this has happened multiple times. I may come back to this during the session. The BDS is a kind of interesting UEFI thing. It is basically, you could call it the user interface. It stands for boot device selection. It's the thing that decides what UEFI is going to load and run after itself. OVMF is an EDK2 platform port to QEMU and SEN. So it's a platform port of UEFI to run in virtual machines on x86. We also have something called ARMvert, which is basically OVMF, but on ARM. And these two badly needs to be merged together, even in the medium term. It's quite horrific that we have two different platform ports just because they happen to be different architectures when we're talking about a completely virtual platform. So that should just be the same. So I'm the tech lead of the UEFI team in LEG. We're called the UEFI team. People mistakenly believe this means we work on UEFI. We do that as well, but parts of it is the EDK2 development. I would say probably the majority of the work we do is in the Linux kernel. We do interact a bit with the UEFI forum to, review and discuss the specifications and so on. We work on various Linux userland tools, like ACPI-CA tools, EFI-vars, DMID code, and we've been looking into the capsule update stuff as well. We look into the joyous bits of ACPI and device tree intersections and how to make it possible for the same kernel to support both sanely. And then we do stuff. Stuff here I refer to as Grub, SMBIOS, ARM Trusted Firmware, LoveOS Firmware Test Suite. Basically anything that touches UEFI in any way is within our remit to do work on. And frequently we end up having to do that because there is no other team that this work fits into, really. Right, to the ranting. First out, ARM. UEFI on ARM was actually fairly well handled. The support was added into the UEFI 2.3 specification, which was released in 2009, and there's been various updates along the way, keeping it up to speed. The interactions between ARM and the UEFI forum for introducing the 32-bit architecture was quite good. actually the support for the 64-bit architecture on the specification side was quite okay as well. There were a few issues that meant it came out later than I would have wanted it to, but it's basically fine. The real issue was to do with actually getting EDK2 on board. And the main issue we had also for the 32-bit side was that ARM basically on an organizational level didn't understand what UEFI was. Right? The specification is the important bit about UEFI. Everything works the same on every platform. Your bootloaders, your test infrastructure, everything is portable and just works. Whereas ARM pretty much comes very much from an embedded background, and everything is device specific, and we do something a special way, and we just keep doing that using the EDK2 code base. So this led to a bunch of unfortunate decisions, basically culminating in what I tend to refer to as ARM using the EDK2 code base to reinvent U-boot badly. One of the main bits of this was what is called the ARM BDS. So I said the entire purpose of UEFI is that it's the same across different architectures, same on different platforms. But we invented a separate BDS for ARM. And it wasn't even in any way ARM specific. It was really just, okay, we want something that's lightweight, that you can implement in a sort of line-based command shell interface, much like U-boot. It really was just an embedded BDS, which may or may not have been a good idea, but the basic point is we came into a standard with an existing code base, and the first thing we did was we changed the user interface to have a special one just for us. This wasn't a good move. And this was done as the first thing, not even looking at enabling the existing BDS that's in EDK2, the Intel BDS, which is kind of big and horrible and awful and fine. But we didn't even do that as a demonstration. And my favorite bit of hate, the built-in Linux loader, BIL. UEFI provides, I'm actually going to stand up and walk. UEFI provides a runtime environment. The architecture of UEFI is such that you can write applications that can run under it, and this includes operating system loaders. Instead of following this, instead of actually using UEFI to be UEFI, we integrated special knowledge into the BDS to know what a Linux kernel was and how to load it. Right? It's horrendously bad. I'm restraining myself quite badly here by not shouting and screaming. What we could have done, right? We could have just ported the grub bootloader and used that. We did port the grub bootloader, but ARM didn't integrate that into its releases or anything. It kept using the built-in Linux loader. In December 2011, which is 4 years ago, support was merged into the Linux kernel for x86 to use a stub loader. So you add some functionality to the Linux kernel that makes it itself an executable EFI application that you can just execute and run, and that's fine. ARM didn't use it, and ARM ports of EDK2 stuck with BIL. I'll get back to that. Actually, can you do the slides? Thank you. So UEFI on AR64 was quite different from on AR32. When we introduced UEFI on 32-bit ARM, we already had a plethora of different bootloaders, mainly U-boot, but other ones as well. So it was just another thing. So it wasn't a big deal. But for AR64, we didn't have any existing firmware infrastructure when we started working on UEFI. And it was the first new architecture, from my point of mind, it was the first new architecture added to the UEFI specification since it stopped being an Intel internal project that didn't have any existing other alternative bootloaders. And so EDK2 on AR64 was done almost as an afterthought. So ARM went out and made public statements that UEFI, that is the firmware for 64-bit ARM, it's going to be UEFI, it's going to be UEFI, it's going to be UEFI. And then the public release of the EDK2 source code for AR64 lagged a year behind the release of the kernel and the foundation model, which people could use to start doing development. It's still shipped with Bill, it's still shipped with the ARM BDS, and no effort was made to assist partners and customers in migrating from existing firmware to provide help with, okay, how do I write my device drivers for this new infrastructure? That just didn't happen, which was a problem. Brian? Next slide. Thanks. Okay, that's the rant on ARM done, mostly. So getting on to complaining about UEFI, which is actually complaining about EDK2. Main issues are with EDK2, not UEFI. I kind of like UEFI. It's a bit horrible, but it's a good thing. It's a specification, it's a standard you can work to. This is good. EDK2 is part of the Tiano Core project, which is kind of a project run by Intel that's escaped a little bit into public. And at the same time, it's like an open source project that doesn't have a Linus, right? It doesn't have a guy who can go, this is the right thing, we're going to change this. So there's this weird kind of consensus-driven thing happening partly inside Intel and occasionally discussed in public outside. And you can talk to people and they'll agree, yeah, that's a good thing, we should do that. And then it doesn't happen because no one quite knows who can make the call. Intel are aware of this, but we're actually quite friendly with Intel in the UEFI forum. You don't compete on firmware, you don't compete on standards, right? You implement them. And no one thinks firmware is sexy, so no one's going to try to one-up the others. But the issue that this leads to is that any of the big changes that we need to do on the EDK2 side, to introduce things like having public platform support, doesn't happen because no one really knows how do you integrate a new platform into EDK2 because there is no standard. If you look at the upstream EDK2 code base, there's like support for 10-ish different platforms, and they're all over the place. They're just stuck somewhere in the tree, and most actual devices that ship with the UEFI, you won't have the source code for that UEFI. It will be, someone will basically take EDK2, they will add some platform support on the side, and never upstream the platform support. So any discussions about changes tend to kind of stall. It's problematic. Next one. So the platform support has been mostly missing. It was a major part of the commercial offering from BIOS vendors, so why would they want to share it? Implementers would start from an augmented EDK2, so say take an EDK2, you have some BIOS vendor special sauce, and or people who would manufacture their own BIOSes, and you would add various bits from elsewhere and not upstream it. And you have these around, so you have OVMF package, you have an option ROM package, this BeagleBoard package with an OMAP package separately from the BeagleBoard package. ARM platform package has a bunch of ARM platforms in it. We're kind of stripping that out now because it doesn't make any sense. So when we've tried to sort this out, it hasn't really met with much success because, as I said, there is no benevolent dictator, there's no one who can just make the call that, okay, we're going to do this, at least no one who cares enough. And then we have the BDS thing. I mentioned this, right? ARM went off and did its own BDS, which wasn't good. So I had a talk last year at the UEFI forum event going, listen guys, we shouldn't be using different BDSs. You have a BDS which is called the Intel BDS, which is a bad thing to begin with, and it had been moved into the Intel-specific implementation package because they also kept their BIOS compatibility support code in there, so they didn't feel it was platform independent anymore, although it used to be. So I had this talk, and I had pretty much no feedback, and then a few months ago, some patches dropped on the mailing list going, oh look, here's a new BDS we did, and it's platform independent, and it's all good. Only it isn't platform independent, but it will be at some point. So we migrated to Intel BDS because that gave us features that weren't in the ARM BDS, features that were mandated by the specification. Crazy things like, if you insert an operating system installer, it will find it and boot it, which is kind of useful. And there was also no interface for things like enrolling keys for UEFI secure boot, which is a bit problematic. So there's now at least 2 BDSs live in the EDK2 codebase. Next one. Right. And everything else that's wrong with the world. Linaro sucks too. We've not done a very good job at helping people do the right thing. The documentation on the wiki is spectacularly outdated, and I really need to do something about that. Most of the new platform ports I come across externally have started by taking the Linaro EDK2 repository and cloning it and starting from there. And it's horrible, and it means lots of manual cleanup. Most new platform ports I've come across use the ARM BDS because, hey, it's called the ARM BDS, and this is an ARM platform, so clearly I should be using it. It's in Linaro's tree, so clearly this is what we should be doing. This needs to stop. And we also have way too many EDK2 repositories on git.linaro.org. I mean, Ryan, you have your for the ARM landing team, which is a separate one from the main Linaro one, which is confusing. We also have the old repositories from when we were managing the releases differently, and they're still up there on git.linaro.org. We need to do something about that. Yeah, and there is a separate 96-port EDK2 repository on GitHub, which I also wasn't too happy about, but there's been discussions, and that is going to disappear at some point in the future. Next one. Please never clone Linaro EDK2 and use it to start a new platform port, please, for you and me. Thank you. Validation. Validation is a bit of a problem. Validation is basically the reason, in my mind, why the ARM BDS happened. Because, oh look, we have these validation things that know how to deal with U-boot. So we have these expect style scripts which wait for text output on a UART, and so we can just hook this straight in, and it'll be just like U-boot, and it'll be great. Unfortunately, real systems don't look like that. Systems that don't use the ARM BDS don't look like that. So we spent effort implementing validation infrastructure that would only ever work with something that wasn't applicable to the real world. That's not going to be very useful, and that's going to take some effort for us actually sorting this out to be able to run validation on real systems. Bad habits. I've been correcting people all week. I will continue correcting people all week. Some people have a very bad habit to refer to UEFI and U-boot as bootloaders. Possibly to distinguish them from ARM-trusted firmware, which runs before UEFI or U-boot. UEFI and U-boot are firmware, right? They're firmware, they're something that's in there, they're basically part of the hardware platform. Calling them bootloaders leads people to think about them as software. And software you can replace. Which means we have a lot of validation that, okay, take the latest firmware and the latest kernel and run them together. But that defeats the purpose of validating firmware, right? Firmware you have there and it's not moving. Maybe if you have really diligent administrators, you will occasionally do a firmware update. But in reality, most systems out there are never going to see a firmware update. You have one firmware and that needs to keep working, for the lifespan of that system. So can you please lightly, of course, don't want anyone, but if you hear anyone calling UEFI or U-boot bootloaders, can you slap them slightly on the wrist just to discourage that? Thank you. Right. So what are we going to do about this, or what are we doing about this? Well, we have restructured how we do our releases. Brian Arkin did an amazing job setting up the original maintainer and release process for Linaro CDK2 work, but basically neither Ryan or me knew UEFI very well when we started, didn't know Git very well when we started, and turns out that process didn't quite scale. It worked fine when you had 3 or 4 or 5 platforms. Start getting into 10, 15, suddenly you're losing a week, a month to do the release, and it's no fun. And we also learned a bit more about Git, so we could do better. So what I did is I invented this thing called Open Platform Package. That's a horrible name, and I kept introducing it as, please give me a better name, and no one does, so it stuck with that name. Basically, this is to work around the issues with EDK2 platform and driver support. It's because we can't get any level of consensus on how to actually keep platform code in upstream EDK2. We create a separate repository where we keep just the platform code. It's a non-rebasing, fast-forward-only repository maintained on git.linaro.org. It contains only the platform support and drivers, and we import it into Linaro EDK2 as submodules for making releases. Pretty much any information you're going to find on the internet about Git submodules is going to tell you never use them. I actually find them really useful because they are a bit painful to deal with, because it makes it very, very difficult for someone to, say, hypothetically, create a platform support code that also requires invasive changes in the core EDK2 code, which are never going to be upstreamable because they didn't think about how to do it properly. So I'm basically using the submodules because it makes life more complicated for others and not for me. I presented this at the UEFI Plugfest in Seattle this year. There were a few people going, that's quaint. There were a few people going, that sounds a bit useful. There were some people going, that sounds really useful. But there was no actual, yeah, let's put it upstream now. So long term, I want this to just be a part of Tiana Core. But I am happy with any solution that gives us multiple platform and driver support into a public source tree. Art. Brian has a microphone. Right? Do you have a microphone?
Can you hear me on the speaker? Okay. So the Intel guys are submitting some changes to the base tool, so you don't actually need to use Git submodule. You can just add the Open Platform PKG directory to the packages path, and it will be able to find everything.
The main point is really that it is a separate repository. So you can't commit a patch which changes core code and adds platform support. So the mechanics are kind of, the mechanics I would like to go away. So, yeah, this is the point at which I started getting quite distracted, and there is no thread to the presentation from this point on. But just to show a bit how the traditional UEFI BIOS might have looked, basically you start off with the upstream Tiana Core EDK2, more likely some snapshot of like UDK, I think they call it, and make a few times a year. You add some CPU support from your CPU vendor. You add some chipset support from your chipset vendor. If you're using one of the BIOS vendors to do, well, or if you're hiring one of the BIOS vendors to do this implementation for you, you will add some of their specific magic source, value add, and so on. And then you implement some platform code and drivers, and you stick it all together, and you have a UEFI implementation for that platform. So with Open Platform Package, it's basically the same thing, but you end up having, instead of having multiple feed-ins for chipsets and CPUs and so on, hopefully all of the platform code and drivers are available in there, and you just use that, and everyone's happy. We've had some changes that make our life easier this year. Since early this year, both myself and Ard are now maintainers for the ARM bits of upstream EDK2. So we could just randomly shovel all of the platform support code into somewhere under the ARM platform stuff, but that wouldn't really be anything, so we're not going to do that. We've also had a lot of help from Laszlo Ersek at Red Hat, who's been really helpful getting the virtualization bits sorted out for ARM, and who's actively working on trying to get back to less divergence between OVMF and what the Red Hat guys refer to as AAVMF. So very grateful for his efforts. So we're trying to bring some positive influence to the project. One of the issues we've had before, as I mentioned, it's basically an Intel internal project that escaped. We've had issues in the past with patches being committed to the repository that have never been sent out to the mailing list for review, sometimes breaking all architectures that aren't Intel. We try to very much lead by example by making sure that everything we do is it's sent out in public, it's reviewed in public, nothing gets committed into any of the ARM components if it hasn't been reviewed by someone other than the patch author. ARM needs to lead by example. It's not, EDK2 isn't our project. So we need to lead by example if we're going to see some change out there. And it has started to. Right? It has started to understand UEFI. It has started to take UEFI seriously. So we're now participating a lot more actively in, well, we're participating at all, I should say, in the UEFI test working group to look at the SET self-certification test suite, and Supreet is doing that. Thank you. The ARM internal UEFI development is shifting its focus, I say more towards server, really totally towards server, which makes a lot of sense because even if you want to go back somewhere from there, at least you've done it right the first time. And we've also had some good changes with how the interactions work between ARM and ARM's landing team at Linaro. Ryan now has a badge, so he can actually go and visit the ARM office without having to, have someone pick him up at the front desk. Sorry? Yeah, brilliant. And that was actually an unintentional pun, but I thought it was cute, so I kept it. They were kept a bit at arm's length before, unfortunately. So that's all good. BDS. We really need to get this new BDS, even if I'm annoyed that it just appeared without anyone telling me in advance. We really need to make sure that we switch to that and we use that and it runs on ARM, even if it's never used in a product, right? That's the kind of the weird thing about the BDS and EDK2. Most commercial products don't use it, the BDS that's in there. They use something from the BIOS vendor or that they develop themselves to fit with their product. But even if that's the case, we still need to make sure that the BDS that the Intel guys are testing with, developing with, using, actually works on ARM as well, and that's what we're using. It does look less messy than Intel BDS, mainly because all of the CSM compatibility support module, the BIOS emulation stuff, has been yanked out. Art?
Well, I think what you just mentioned about not running the upstream BDS is kind of the point for this new BDS as well, that they separate the GUI from the actual BDS logic, so you can replace the GUI and still keep the BDS parts.
Yeah.
So I guess even in that scenario, it's still an improvement to move to the UI app BDS.
Hopefully. Next slide. We have to kill Bill. We've started. Bill is now a standalone UEFI application rather than integrated into the ARM BDS. This is a start. We still have this unfortunate situation. We have two unfortunate situations. One is that the kernel stub loader is not upstream for 32-bit, so any 32-bit UEFI platform still kind of needs this to be able to boot. And the other issue is with validation, as I mentioned. There's validation, implemented stuff, tests running, defined to use this thing, and people will have to change all of those if they need to actually get rid of Bill. Art, can you pass the microphone down?
I can speak loudly.
Yes, you can.
When is the What is the state of the Linux 32-bit support?
Basically, I got bored with the fix map. Just the fix map never got sorted, so we didn't get early IO remap in, and I stopped caring.
Right. Okay.
Art's actually kind of kept up, because Art's a crazy guy, right? He will just go, oh, it's a Friday night and I'm bored. I'm going to make sure that I can get the UEFI support in the Linux kernel running again on current upstream. So he does that from time to time. So I actually think we're not very far away from being able to get it in. Well, or get it out. We should. The problem I have, though, is that I'm in the Linaro Enterprise group, and no one in the enterprise group is asking me to work on 32-bit. It's definitely the right thing to do, but it's never going to be, a top priority formally. So it kind of depends on Art or myself being bored and doing it in our spare time. But I agree, it should go upstream. Even existing platforms like the D01 would benefit greatly from it. I wrote some scripts. The EDK2 build system is well known for being kind of hard. So I wrote a set of scripts to help me hide that. And basically all it does is it gives me the ability to have a config file where I keep the grid details, and then I can just call a build and with a platform name and build it. It's not advanced in any way, but it's kind of convenient shorthand, so it's on a public Git repository, and if you want to play around with it, do play around with it. Yeah, so it does some cute things like detecting the number of cores you have and build that much in parallel. You can build with GCC or Clang, and picks the correct EDK2 toolchain profile, because you have a different toolchain profile for every single release of GCC. Which is a bit annoying, but this hides it for you, so you don't need to worry about it. Validation. AR64 is now a fully supported platform in Intel's LoveOS. So LoveOS is basically a fake Linux distribution that the Intel guys put together to use solely for the purpose of validating the UEFI infrastructure. So it includes things like the firmware test suite and runs things to make sure that ACPI is basically in the same state, and your basic UEFI support is in the same state. But LoveOS doesn't slot into the existing Lava setup, and we need to work on fixing that. We badly need to work on fixing that, because that's something we need to keep doing automatedly on nightly builds kind of thing to see when anything breaks. It's going to require work and effort, and it's probably going to require more effort than the Lava team can do on their own. So I'm expecting we're going to have to put some leg resource onto helping with this. And we need to look into test suites for other components that are also relevant to our boot architecture. As I said, basically anything that touches UEFI is within our remit. So we need to get the grub test suite running on AR64. We need to get the EFI wars test suite passing on AR64. It currently doesn't. Well, that might be a lie. Last time I checked, it didn't. Userland. We're still working in an ecosystem that managed to get used to a single de facto standard hardware platform. PC was not necessarily a drafted specification. They had one, but really it was more about legacy and keeping the same thing going as the last one and being compatible. Which led to some crazy, crazy things. Like there's way too many things that randomly go map things in dev-mem to scan randomly around the memory map, seeing if they can find some tables, where on some platforms there isn't any RAM, and you may actually silently kill the kernel from within user space, which is kind of generally considered a bad thing. So we've done some work to get the basic things like DMI decode and ACPI dump actually using proper kernel interfaces instead. Roy did most of that. He's here somewhere. There he is. But we still find other ones, and you find other crazy things. You find some tools that do some parsing of some tables and assume that chars are assigned, or other things that break on x86. Oh yeah, Ivan's back there as well. He did half of the DMI decode stuff at least. Next. Documentation. Said our documentation on wiki.linaro.org is badly outdated. I'm really sorry, and I'm going to have to do something about that. And I do actually mean that. I'm actually going to do something about that. We actually did a decent job initially documenting all these things as we were learning, going, okay, here's this crazy special case, and this is really broken, but we can work around it like this, and then this is completely crazy, but we hacked around it this way, and you can kind of do this. And I think we still have like 3 or 4 pages. You guys are a bit guilty as well on the, here's how you can magically build a special grub image which won't crash on this platform by manually specifying specifically all of the modules you need to include, and not that one which causes everything to fall over when you try to load it. It's nowhere near that bad anymore, but we still have that in the wiki. So if you've read the wiki and you went, oh God, is it really that bad? It isn't. We're pretty good now. We just didn't get around to fix the wiki, and I'm really sorry. And you guys, we really want more interaction with external users of UEFI on ARM than we're currently having. Questions you have, ideas, opinions, rants, anything would be kind of good to have, because we're a little bit operating in a vacuum and going, okay, I could go work on that. I don't know who cares, but I can go work on that. So you can find, we have a mailing list at list.linaro.org. We're always in Linaro Enterprise on Freenode. And of course, the public EDK2 development mailing list has now moved to list.01.org. Is there a question?
Yeah, I may have missed it, but I hope to hear some like status or your thoughts or plans on EFS stop in corner, the EFS stop code. I want to know.
Did you just step in?
No, I've been here for like 20 minutes, the last 20 minutes, maybe.
Okay, so what was your question?
Ready, right? EFS stop.
Yeah, what was your question?
No, I just wanted to know what's the, so I noticed that you have upstream, you have been trying to upstream a bunch of stuff related to EFS stop. So I wanted to know what's your plan or thoughts about the current status of EFS stop, and what's your plan?
Are you mean on 32-bit or on 64-bit?
64-bit.
On 64-bit, it's been upstream since over a year ago.
Yeah, I know. I'm just saying that recently you are doing some patches around EFS stop. So is there something bigger going on, or is just those patches, you think? We've
found a couple of issues, which we're trying to sort out by actually doing changes.
Okay.
Basically, we got things working, and then we didn't worry so much about it.
Okay.
And now more people are starting to use it.
Yeah.
And that actually triggers a few issues, and we need to go back and change.
Okay.
So it basically works.
Okay.
But you can expect to see some more patches come, for the next couple of months, because we found some issues and we're trying to rework around that.
Okay, so it's more about fixing issues instead of you have a bigger plan of doing something differently.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, got it.
So I have a question. Could you explain when we should use Linaro UEFI at list.linaro.org and when we should use EDK2 devel?
Well, I mean,
sort of roughly know, but I'm sure others maybe don't.
Good question. So, I mean, this is the public EDK2 development mailing list for all architectures. So, if you have a question that is ARM specific, then it may be better to ask here. If you're not sure, it may be better to ask here, rather than talk to this list with people for all architectures. But on the other hand, we are a first-class citizen in the UEFI land these days, and if we have issues on ARM systems, those are still issues for UEFI, and we still need to fix them.
It's just worth pointing out that the EDK2 devel list is a subscriber-only list, so to send an email to it, you first need to subscribe, otherwise you'll get a bounce.
Right, and having said that, I might also add that the Linaro UEFI list is not a subscriber-only list, but it will moderate you if you're not subscribed. This is basically a spam filter, and it does stop a fair amount of spam from getting through. What actually happens is I get an email, I go, yes, that looks like a real person, and I automatically add you to a whitelist, and you never need to worry about it ever again.
I'm just interested with this idea that firmware is part of the platform. and whether it should become better for things like FVP to have a default UEFI implementation bundled with it, because I'm fed up with digging around behind the sofa to find some implementation that works when I download it.
I'm going to hand that one over to Ryan.
Oh, you did. Well, should pressure be put on to bundle a UEFI implementation with FVP? Should the documentation be improved? If you go to the FVP documentation, it points to wiki.linaro.org/ARM64, and then you have to be psychic to work out how to get a EFI implementation.
I'm sorry.
As Dan Handley at ARM, but it's not my responsibility, but someone from ARM should probably be answering that. I don't know if there's anyone from the developers tool team or the the FVP team, but basically I agree. It's not just UEFI, it's also trusted firmware. Generally, working firmware distribution should be provided with the models, and I agree, and I have addressed that with that team. Maybe we need to pick that up again.
The arch teams will go through Horizon, so it's going to be a default.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be forced on, but it to have fun.
Yeah, just something out of the box that works and that you can upgrade later.
Yeah, so what we're trying to do in Linaro in sort of partnership with ARM is we're trying to put together some sort of packaged releases that you build from source. So if you look at the Linaro release pages, we now have a thing, we call them the platforms releases. And the idea is that you get your fast model, your FVP model, separately, of course, but then you go to the Linaro page to get your deliverables. There's a manifest there that you sync, and it builds the FVP version of UEFI. And now this is from the tree that Leif quite rightly said it shouldn't really be there. It's from my own personal clone of EDK2. But that has, basically, I have some specials because of the problems that we've had with not killing Bill. Things like that. So I've had to hack a few things, and they're not upstreamable because we shouldn't be upstreaming. We should just be killing Bill, of course, but rather than upstream. But just to get it working at the moment as a bootloader, this sort of thing, rather than using it as firmware, because we are at the moment still trying to use it just like replacing U-boot, and that's obviously the wrong strategy in the long term. But yeah, at the moment we're expecting people to go to the platforms release from the landing team and build all the stuff from source. Then you get trusted firmware, you get UEFI, and you get all this stuff built that you then just run with a model script that we provide as well.
Why source only? Because Leif just told us that firmware and software are different stuff. Didn't he?
Why what?
Why deliver a source? Leif has just been saying that one thing we've got to get through our heads is that firmware and software are different things.
Yeah. This is true, but of course the firmware is still in development, right? Of course, yeah. So if you want to work on the platforms that ARM are supporting through the ARM landing team, you may be working on trusted firmware, or you could be working on UEFI itself, or you could be working on the kernel. There's all these different layers, and we build them from source. The idea is you have everything built from source, so that you have the matching set of the things that you need, because it is all changing and it needs to be kept in step. And yeah, so we're having a problem keeping things in step. So if you're building it all from a tagged set of sources, then you know that you're getting a version of trusted firmware that matches a version of UEFI that matches the kernel that you're using, and the DTB goes with it as well. Because none of these things, the DTB should be static, but it's not, because it changes kernel version. A 3.10 DTB won't work on a 4.2 kernel, right? Well, it sort of will work, but this stuff is in flux, right?
For what it's worth, I agree with you.
For the FVPs, the DTs that have been upstream and mainline should continue to work. There is nothing in there that should be broken from a 3.10 kernel to a 14 kernel, at least for ARM64. If there is anything that has broken, I've not heard about it. We should fix that. The old DTs should work so long. If the models have changed, then that's probably why the old DTs don't work, but that's because the models have changed.
Yeah, I agree there. But of course, the stuff that I'm supporting isn't just the FVPs, of course, which we were talking about. I'm also talking about TC2 support and Juno support, things like that, and things have evolved over time. But yeah, you're right, with the FVP stuff, that's been mostly static, unless you change the actual FVP model itself.
Yeah, for TC2 and Juno, all the stuff that's changed has been additive or has been alternative. At least on the Juno DT,
maybe if you're running a pure upstream kernel, that probably is true.
Yeah, unfortunately, upstream is the only thing that exists.
Well, that's not true, obviously, but it only exists in your world. But ARM's partners are using things like Big Little and things like that. They're using all this HMP stuff that's not upstream, right? And that's a whole bigger problem, of course. But that stuff does exist. It just doesn't exist in upstream. And yeah, to your mind, it doesn't exist. But it's reality. People use it.
So the issue there is more that those releases have been strictly tied, rather than the DTs changing. All this whole argument about DTs changing because different software releases that are completely unrelated are not interoperable. That's a problem, admittedly, yeah. But I just want to make sure that that's obviously the case, rather than this being a regression, which it doesn't actually appear to be.
Yeah, but I think, yeah, you're right. But the main thing wasn't really, I wasn't trying to pick on DT. I was trying to say that everything at the moment is pinned together, and you need to have matching versions of things. It may well be that on a lot of the things the DT doesn't actually matter in this case, but we're trying to pin everything together so you know you have a compatible set of all of the things that you're trying to use, really. And that's the thing. So with an FVP is one of these things, and we shouldn't be changing it, but the reality is that we're changing it regularly at the moment as things move on. PSCI, all these other things are changing. And
we have also had the unfortunate history of the model changing under our feet.
Yeah, and the model parameters and everything
that doesn't help.
In that case, don't they? Yeah.
So we're not even treating the model of the hardware as hardware.
Yeah.
That's kind of why things end up like this.
For sure. More questions?
I saw a hand. Or maybe someone's stretching. Okay, well, I'm here all week, grab me. Okay, no, final comment?
Sorry, so you had all the things that have gone wrong and so on. So if people are leaving here taking away 5 or fewer points, what should those be?
Basically, it all works, right? It's actually, I would say it's a solved problem. What the issues we're having now is looking at maintenance, maintainership, making sure that we get some public platform code, right? We need to keep working to improve the EDK2 code base, improve the habits of the EDK2 project. But UEFI on ARM is a thing, it works. Whoa.
Can you just explain? You said we shouldn't be cloning the Linaro EDK2 repository. Should we be cloning the EDK2 repository and the open platform package and adding to that? And do we upstream that to you then to add platform support, or what should we be doing?
Optimally, what I want to see is if your platform support requires any kind of changes to core code, you upstream that to EDK2. And anything that can go into open platform package, yeah, send it to me, send it to the Linaro UEFI mailing list, and I'll put it in there. The only thing about the open platform package, I didn't actually go into detail here, maybe I should have, is because I'm hoping for it to be accepted into upstream EDK2 at some point, I'm still going to ask that you do the contributed under type things that's required to contribute to EDK2, even though it isn't technically EDK2.
Okay. And is this documented anywhere on the wiki pages, working with,
Badly.
With this?
I'm going to sort that out. I should probably start this week.
Yeah, that would help.
But do feel free to nag me on mailing list, on IRC, and in any other form until I do. Okay? Thank you very much, and time for lunch.